That's about as good as it gets. Most of us here today, as Christians, have experienced God's grace. Just hearing that music is one example. We understand what is meant by grace, whether from God or from our neighbors or singers. From God, it's the sun and the rain, our health, the beautiful place we live, our families. References to grace abound in our culture, even among non-religious people. There, but for the grace of God, go I. I escaped death by the grace of God. We've heard these phrases, and they're a positive reference to a holy power that's not always acknowledged in our casual conversations. In the Exodus passage, God is described as compassionate and gracious. Gracious meaning, and I quote, to extend kindness or show delight towards someone who may not be deserving of that treatment. I really like the idea that God shows delight toward us, even though we are undeserving. Our prayers often begin with something like, "O loving and gracious God," and I kind of chuckle inside at the idea that we need to set our minds to think of God in a loving, compassionate, and gracious way right before we're going to ask for something. Often we're asking for forgiveness. Forgiveness for our sins is part of God's grace, but it's not the same as grace. Typically, I need a lot of forgiveness, so I used to see forgiveness and grace as one and the same, but they're not. Grace is granted without any prologue, no stipulation, and no asking on our part. It's just poured out like rain upon us in abundance. Occasionally, we may ask, why does God withhold the rain from me? Why won't my children speak to me? Why did my child, my loved one, have to die? I don't have an answer for that because I can't understand the mind of God. So I turn to my source for all things theological, the movies. In the movie The Shack, one of the many great scenes is where God, played by Octavia Spencer, is relaxing on the porch enjoying breakfast in the sun. Mac, the main character, comes to join her and accusingly says, "With all the pain in the world, wars and disasters going on, you sit here doing nothing." And God replies, "Honey, you have no idea all the things I'm doing right now." The point is not that God is allowing those things to happen, but that we cannot, with our limited understanding, know all that God is involved with. We can't know how everything works. See this DVD? I have no understanding how it can possibly work. How can all the images of a movie be recorded on here? Imagine a scene with a tree blowing gently in the wind. The camera records 300,000 leaves, all moving in different ways, each one reflecting the light differently. And all that is merely in the background. There's other action going on in the shot, all happening in a few seconds, but going on for 90 minutes or more, and being somehow stored on here in pluses and minuses, to be played back by a beam of light reflecting off the surface. Talk about a miracle. I don't understand how it works, but I believe it will, and I trust it will. I have faith. And when it doesn't work, I rely on the grace of my friend Steve to make it work. That brings me to another facet of God's grace. Each of us has a place as disseminators of God's grace. Besides Steve, there's lots of examples here in this room. Ken and Dory, have shown God's grace by going thousands of miles to a dangerous place to help children they did not know. They just poured out God's grace on strangers, people who were not like them, expecting nothing in return. Bob and Dan show God's grace simply by saying hello to strangers they pass on the street, expecting nothing in return. Daphne will pray for anyone who is in need of prayer. Karen has a heart so full of grace, she pours it out on all who participate in worship every Sunday. And she still has enough to show grace to Christy every day, asking nothing in return. Pat Dwyer manages to attend church faithfully, either in person or on Zoom. And she shares her ever-sharp wit with all who engage with her. She's filled to overflowing with the grace of God. When I asked Connie if she and Ralph would provide a place for Pastor Karen to stay the night on the weekends that she would be preaching, do you know what she said? Not, well, can we meet her first? Or even, let me talk to Ralph. She said, do you think she could stay for the whole weekend? I could host potluck on Saturday night. That, my friends, is God's grace on display. Sometimes by people who don't know the gift they are giving. It just comes naturally. I have been the recipient of grace from this entire congregation. You have accepted me as I am and forgiven me when I've done wrong. In short, you model God's grace, and I'm grateful to you. My children have shown me grace in wonderful and humbling ways. They came long distances to our wedding. We call each other once a week just to catch up, and if I forget, they will make the call. That small gesture means the world to me. That they make the time in their busy lives to chat with their dad is priceless. Especially because I know that many people do not have that kind of relationship with family. It makes me so grateful to my kids and for my kids. So, are we required to be grateful for grace? Seems like that would be the polite thing. But I don't think God expects gratitude. God is not a petty God. I do not imagine him or her sitting in judgment and counting, Walt didn't give me thanks for the rain this week. That's one demerit. On the other hand, the graciousness of God means we can calm ourselves and relieve our stress by recognizing that God is looking out for us. This recognition of God's grace around us is one of the perks of Christianity. I have met many people who deny that they are recipients of any sort of grace. What did God ever do for me? I had to raise myself and 3 siblings with an alcoholic mother. Or, like the character Mackenzie in The Shack, they might say, God, you didn't save my child. Sadly, those situations do exist. I see parents who have not heard from their children in years, brothers who never speak to each other, people who've been hurt by society, robbed, assaulted. I can scarcely understand how hard it must be to see God's grace in those situations. I often feel that I don't have authority to point out God's grace to them because I have not experienced their pain. I have known some successful people who fail to see how they've been blessed by God. I've heard men my age say, these kids today going into debt to go to college, ridiculous. I never got any help with college. I worked my way through. I'm a self-made man. I earned everything I have. Oh, okay, how about those coworkers who traded shifts with you so you could study for the big exam? How about your boss who let you set your schedule around your class times? Those people were showing you God's grace. If you went to a public university, how about the taxpayers who, unlike today, mostly finance public higher education? You were receiving the grace of God. Those individuals seem sad to me because they don't enjoy the grace they have received. God doesn't require gratitude, and neither do those who model God's grace to us. But feeling gratitude, we are blessed by the awareness of God's presence in our lives. In the passage from Ephesians, we are told that we are to be saved by the grace of God. Suppose we interpret that for a moment to mean not only Jesus' grace, but the grace of every one of us. What would happen if we could all have awareness of the grace of God, modeled by the graciousness of our fellow man? How would that change the world we live in? Would young men feel less lonely, less aggrieved? Would experiencing grace from others make people less afraid of the others and more likely to embrace people who don't look like them, don't believe like them? Wouldn't it be great to find out? Thank you all.